this webinar. Yeah, okay. This meeting is being recorded. This webinar is produced jointly with GLAPN, the archives, with Pride Northwest, and with the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. We're talking today. Well, let me go back. From the time we started talking about this series of confronting hate webinars way last fall, it was pretty obvious to us on the LGBTQ side that we were going to need to talk about anti-trans hatred particularly. We thought that last September, and all I can tell you is that it has gotten worse and it has gotten more urgent from that time to this with the legislation, anti-trans legislation that we're seeing at the state level nationwide. We've got three people from the trans community, the Portland area trans community, who are going to be speaking to this in one way or another. Reid Vanderburgh is a retired therapist who is now on the board of PFLAG Portland. Mikki Gillette does a variety of things for Basic Rights Oregon, including keeping up with legislature. And Laura Rogg is currently secretary at GLAPN, who will bring his own perspective to what's going on. I'm going to ask each of these people, and we're going to go in order of age, no offense, to ask each of these people to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background. Reid, you can go first.
I wasn't sure which direction you meant when you said going by age.
Oh, well, we're starting with the older ones first.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm a trans man. I transitioned in the mid-90s here in Portland. I don't know, I could say a lot of things about myself. I was a founding member of the Portland Lesbian Choir in 1986. So I've been around the LGBT community through one letter or another for quite a long time. I am a retired therapist. I worked primarily with trans clients during the course of my career, about 450 people, helping them answer the question, how do I want to live my life in the context of gender? I also sing in the Portland Gay Men's Chorus. I'm on the board of PFLAG. I'm on the board of William Temple House, which is a local social service organization. So that's all I'll say for now, because I could take up the whole time just talking about me. So on to someone else.
Okay, Mikki, you're next.
Oh, okay. If we're going by age, wouldn't it be Laura? Just kidding. My name's Mikki Gillette. I'm the Major Gifts Officer at Basic Rights Oregon. I've been on staff for about 5.5 years. I transitioned in 2010. I was working as a substitute teacher at the time, which I would not recommend. We're going to be talking a lot about legislation that involves trans kids, and I guess the frame of reference I bring to that is when I was young, there just wasn't a concept of parents affirming their children, helping them transition, go through a puberty that aligns with their gender identity. And getting to see that happen, getting to work with families of trans kids and meet them and meet their children is one of the most heartening and healing things that I do in my work.
Okay, Laura.
I'm Laura. Mainly my background is working with GLAPN and being invested in history. I think I began transitioning the most recently. I think about 3 years ago, and my perspective is that I didn't start my transition as a minor, but I did get very good medical care, so I know what people should be getting and aren't. Yeah, and I'll dive more into that experience further in the talk.
Okay, thanks. Mikki, part of your job at BRO is watching over legislation, and there's a lot of that going on right now. Can you can you tell us what's going on legislatively at the state level?
Yes, this is kind of an unprecedented year in terms of the amount of anti-LGBTQ legislation that's being introduced and passed into law in states around the country. So there have been over 250 bills introduced in 33 states. Two of the largest buckets of these bills focus on trans youth. So 66 of them are designed to prevent trans youth, especially transgender girls, from playing sports on teams that align with their gender identities. And 35 are, their purpose is to prevent trans youth from attaining life-saving healthcare. The sports bills have passed in 8 states. And one thing to note about those is the first one actually happened last year in Idaho, and a conservative federal judge in Idaho immediately injuncted it and said it wasn't legal. So the states that have gone on to introduce these bills and pass them aren't doing it because they know it's going to be successful legislation, or it's actually going to be legal for the bills to do what they say they do. They're just doing it to win points with their base. Among the healthcare bills, those have passed in 2 states, first Arkansas and then Tennessee. Tennessee has actually passed 5 anti-trans bills. Let's see, the sports bills, we should say that the American Academy of Pediatrics says that trans youth should play on sports teams that align with their gender identities. The healthcare bills, those are, just personally, it's hard for me to sit with what's happening there emotionally, because when I think about, like I said, when I was young, there wasn't really a category of transgender. I didn't have words to talk about what was happening to me, but it was just nightmarish, like the dysphoria, especially during puberty, to feel my body changing in exactly the ways that I didn't want it to. And to know that my peers were seeing me in a way that I didn't see myself, just because of what was happening with my body. And to imagine being a trans kid today and to know that there was a remedy for that, and there were words for that, but that politicians in my state were trying to prevent me from being able to do what I needed to do, it's infuriating, and it's just scary to think about what might be happening with these kids. And when people say, oh, they're kids, it's a fad, they don't know what, how could they make a decision like that? I think it's the thing that I knew most about myself. And also every medical association in our country is actively opposing these bills because they work with trans kids who need this kind of healthcare, and they know how important it is. And I'll just close by saying there's a doctor in Arkansas named Michelle Hutchinson who runs the state's largest clinic for trans youth, where she serves 200 patients. She was interviewed just a few weeks after the bill passed in her state, and she said 4 of her patients had already attempted suicide because of what the law was going to do, and that others were calling her to ask about black market drugs that they would be, taking without a doctor's care. And so when we say this healthcare is life-saving, it's not just words or hyperbole. The trans community can't live without this healthcare that these politicians are trying to take away.
Thanks. Yeah, I've talked to parents of transgender children who say that their kids were pretty well fixed on the appropriate gender by the time they were 3 or 4. That they knew what they were regardless of externals. Tell me, Mikki, why is this happening now? Is this spontaneous? Did a dozen different legislatures at once decide to do it, or is there something else driving this?
Yeah, there is something else. This is what's called model legislation, where national groups come up with an idea and then they draft the legislation that can be tailored by each state to agree with their state code. A couple of the groups that are making this model legislation available are the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, the Family Policy Alliance. And if you're LGBTQ, you know that when family shows up in a group's name, it's not always a good sign. They're a very conservative group. The bills are also being tailored, so a state can actually just ask a group called Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is a legal group, to help them tailor the legislation for their state code. The Alliance for Defending Freedom, or ADF, has been classified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They support the recriminalization of sexual acts between LGBTQ adults. They've also lobbied for the state-sanctioned sterilization of trans people in Eastern European countries. So they're a group that just actively works against LGBTQ folks around the world.
Okay, well, this is obviously happening in states with Republican majorities who just lost a presidential election and probably don't have a lot on their plates right now. But do you think it really has popular support?
Yeah, that's one thing that's really heartening, is that these bills are very unpopular. There was a poll from the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion that found 2/3 of Americans oppose both of these types of bills, the sports bills and the healthcare bills. And it was pretty even across Democratic and Republican respondents. So for the healthcare bills, 69% of Democrats opposed it and 70% of Republicans opposed it. For the sports bills, 69% of Democrats and 66% of Republicans opposed the bills. And I think, that's because these bills are just solutions to problems that don't exist. There's something that pleases a small base that's out of step with, public opinion. So the fact that they're unpopular is heartening, but the fact that they're going ahead is dismaying, because it shows that these folks who are politicians in Republican states don't need to answer to public opinion. They just need to win their primaries to get reelected, and they're willing to do these really cruel and awful things to a vulnerable group in order to do that.
Yeah. Reid, I'm sure you're starting to see some feedback in PFLAG, even in a blue state, about this. Can you, can you tell us what's happening in PFLAG in this regard?
Well, our particular chapter isn't as affected as others would be, because we focus very much on the families that are local to us. And because these bills are not part of Oregon politics, we don't talk about that a whole lot in our chapter. But the chapters in the states that are affected, they are definitely, all parents want the best for their kids. They want their kids to be safe and happy. And if you live in a district where things like this are happening, that would be a scary thing for the parent, especially if you've got a kid who's participating in sports and would like to be able to as their true gender. So it's going to become more of an issue as these bills progress. And I just wanted to piggyback also on something that Mikki said a few minutes ago. About half of my clients knew exactly who they were from a really young age. There was one mom who called me because her 4-year-old had crawled into her lap and said, "Mommy, I know you think I'm a tomboy, but I'm really a boy." And as a trans therapist, the parents that called me were PFLAG type of parents. They wanted the best for their kids. They weren't trying to change their kids. They wanted to know what their move was to support their kid. So yeah, I'd say, and the other half didn't know who they were. They were in deep denial, as I was myself throughout most of my life.
Yeah, we're seeing, well, Of course, social media doesn't stop at the border, and so we're a blue state, or at least we're a blue region, and I'm sure that is having an impact on young people locally, you know, in the schools and one thing or another. Reid, you transitioned before there was much social media at all. I would imagine, you know, I would imagine that the pressures are greater now, and that young people going to school every day, you know, in the atmosphere of the typical high school or middle school are having some problems with this. Laura, your transition is most recent. How do you feel about that? Just about what you're seeing on social media.
Well, I think when I started getting an idea of my transness through social media was a very different context than even now. Like, I kind of came in when like blogging was just winding down, and so it was a lot more like long form, and now things are way more condensed. So it is a little hard even for me to imagine what that is like. But I imagine that the sharing of all of these experiences can equally be really validating for people that don't have that in their life. Like, I didn't grow up knowing barely any gay people, definitely didn't know that trans people really existed other than like movies where they died. And so I imagine it's like just radically different now to hear like all of these small snippets of people's life and experience as trans people. Yeah, in a way that like I don't even have the same context that someone born like 5 years after me has.
Yeah, and of course, there's on one hand, there's the trans positive stuff, and on the other hand, there's this overwhelming trans negative stuff.
Yeah, you have this access to people's experiences, which is wonderful, but you also have access to what everyone on the earth thinks of trans people, which is not always great. And so that can definitely be very overwhelming and very easy to find. Yeah.
It would make me feel like I wasn't safe going out on the street.
Yeah, I think for the trans community, there's always been that dynamic of hypervisibility and invisibility. And there is, I think, consistently debate over which one is better. And that I don't personally think that's a helpful debate, because I think both have huge issues in like super different ways, and that hypervisibility and invisibility can shift in a person's life. Like, you know, me before beginning HRT had a very different experience with visibility as opposed to me now. And so dealing with all these ebbs and flows while also dealing with the visibility of transness within politics, yeah, that's just a constant part of gender, I guess.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
One of the things that that we tend to caution people about anyway is don't read the comments on a Facebook post. But would you please tell us what HRT is?
Hormone replacement therapy. It is a part of medical transitioning, which not everyone does, but I chose to do.
Okay, thanks. It's just one of those things that people in the audience might not know. And I didn't know it for a long time either. So It really does sound like we're dealing with the legacy of the Trump administration here, and the amount of hatred that got sown or got unleashed. I'm sure it's possible the hatred was there anyway. But Reid, as the elder here, can you talk about how things are different recently than they were once upon a time?
Well, it was a double-edged sword back in the 90s. I felt blessed, actually, because I started transition at a time when email was available to me, but there really wasn't much else there was no such thing as social media. That's much more recent development. But I had connection with other people by email, and generations of people before me transitioning didn't even have that. So they really had no connection with each other. And it led to the very bare beginnings of community. At the same time, we weren't in the limelight. We weren't on anybody's radar, which meant we weren't a target. So no, we didn't have any civil rights officially, but we also weren't specifically targeted with all these kinds of bills. So now people are in the limelight and targeted at the same time. We were just invisible. And there's a phrase that I heard not long ago that really resonated with me, because it didn't sit well with me when people would say, I now have male privilege. And I thought there's something not quite right about that. And then I heard the phrase conditional privilege. And I thought that's exactly what it is. I have male privilege as long as I don't come out. So when I do in-person presentations for classrooms, I leave that room and I think I just came out to 30 people I don't know. Am I still safe? So I think it's a more nuanced experience of privilege than just to say trans men now have male privilege automatically.
Yeah, you were telling us earlier about a situation with your passport. You want to tell tell everybody about that?
Yeah, my passport has expired. I have had one since 1998. It's only ever said male, but rumor had it during the Trump administration. And I'm not one that really follows politics really closely. It's hard for me to read things of that sort and really absorb what I'm reading. But rumor had it that the Trump administration was going to make it extremely difficult for me to renew my passport and still have it say M. That what would be used was what was on my original birth certificate. And so then I would end up with a passport that looked like this picture that would say Reid, that would say female. There's no way that I was going to travel with that kind of passport. So I let it expire and decided, okay, I'll renew it after Trump is no longer in office. And now that's in process. But our rights are so tenuous that things like that can be jerked away from us in a heartbeat, and then we're stuck.
Yeah, and gender is so appropriate. I've heard people say, talk about male privilege and without really acknowledging how hard men can be on men who present effeminate. That I don't think, that personally that trans people automatically gain privilege that way, because the presentation is still so important. But anyway, we're in a blue state, which means that we've got rights by law, and means that our legislators are generally seeing things our way. But nationally, we're looking at a disaster in terms of what's happening through the Bible Belt in the Republican states. How can we? What do we need to learn? First of all, I'm not the least bit convinced that we're safe here. That a little tip in the political balance of the state might bring this home to the Oregon legislature. And so I would like to know what all of you think is the best thing for us to do, given that we're in a blue state. Mikki?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, we're fortunate to have a lot of progressive, pro-LGBTQ legislators, and we've had governors who support the community for quite a long time. And that doesn't mean that we're immune to the types of attitudes that we're seeing across the country. There's a group currently in Oregon called Parents' Rights in Education, and they're the first kind of active anti-LGBTQ group in our state since the Oregon Citizens Alliance, which some people might remember from the bad old days. PRIE is, they're conservative on a lot of issues. They oppose anti-racism training in schools. They oppose student health centers that in high schools that could give reproductive healthcare counseling. They're very against comprehensive sex education because it's LGBTQ inclusive. They call it indoctrination. They say teachers are trying to convince students to switch their genders and so on. Before the pandemic, they were really active in going to school board meetings and trying to convince boards to not approve comprehensive sex education. Since then, they've started recruiting school board candidates. So they want to find candidates to run for school boards who share their views. So that is an area that Basic Rights Oregon is looking at really closely. We don't want them to gain footholds and to kind of be able to flip school boards in ways that are harmful to our community. So something to do if you want to oppose this kind of hate in our state is to get involved with Planned Parenthood or with Basic Rights Oregon. We did some phone and text banking just to let people know who was running for school board in different races that looked kind of threatening, where the kind of candidates who I was talking about could win, just to sort of stay abreast of what's going on, and then supporting the candidates and letting them know, if you have a trans person in your life, you can let your representative or senator know, hey, this is important to me. This isn't just an idea that you hear about on the news. This affects our daily lives.
Okay, so school boards, we should start going to school board meetings, right? And I know that I live in Clackamas County, and we don't have, I think the town I live in doesn't seem to be specifically anti-trans, but I know the next town over is having some problems at the city council level. And I'm thinking, those of us that are concerned about it should probably, when the mayor of Canby decides not to issue a proclamation for Transgender Day of Visibility, that suggests to me that he hasn't really heard enough from the transgender supporting people in town. I think we're all going to have to look at that a little bit closer. Laura, you had a story that you told us about being very visible and vulnerable in Oregon.
This was actually my first day living in Oregon. This was the day that I moved, and me and my very large friend, who I was very thankful was with me, stopped at a rest stop, and I ended up using the restroom. At the time, there were only 2 gendered restrooms, and I hadn't gone through. I just was at a point in my transition where I was not getting gendered consistently one way or the other. And so I didn't really know which one to use. And so I ended up using the women's, because I was like, well, that's what a bigot would want me to use. That I got misgendered fairly often. So I was like, this seems safer than looking like this and going into a men's restroom. And then was told by many people and threatened by many people because I was a man using a woman's restroom. And so I think that gets into a lot of the points that we've talked about with that, that conditional privilege, where it's very dependent on how people see you, which can change every day, and can change depending on region. For instance, I got misgendered way more in California than I do in Oregon. Don't know why, but there's lots of weird things like that. But also Oregon, you know, I am reluctant to say that it's like a safe state for trans people when my first experience being across the Oregon border was being threatened by a full rest stop of people. Where politically, I think there's like, you know, we're a blue state, but what about the counties that don't have as much of a voice, and like the fact that that takes up a huge portion of the state, and that, yeah, we don't exclusively interact with people who live in Portland, or even people that live in Portland can be really fucked up and just still live here. Yeah.
Okay, Mikki, I'm obviously not an attorney, but it seems to me that most of the laws that we're looking at are actually unconstitutional. Do you know what's going on nationally to confront that in particular?
Yeah, well, first, I think you're right. I think these are unconstitutional. The sports bills would seem to violate the Equal Protection Clause by discriminating against a certain class of people. There's a lot of case law about the rights of doctors to treat their patients that would make the healthcare laws seem like non-starters. I know that groups like the ACLU and the Transgender Law Center, Lambda Legals, have called these bills unconstitutional. I think they're in the stage now where they're finding the right plaintiffs who can challenge these laws where they're being passed. And I think we're going to see some lawsuits coming forward pretty quickly because the laws are so egregious. It wouldn't surprise me if they were injuncted and not allowed to go into place. And then, from there would be the hearings, and it seems like the groups that support trans people are really confident that they're going to prevail.
Yeah, I would hope so. Unfortunately, it takes so much time. First of all, you have to have the crime, and then you have to have, you go through the process. I hope we don't have to wait that long for something to happen. But what can we do? When we're talking about what can we do in a blue state, one of the things we could do is support the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, certainly. So that's 3 things already. We've got go to your school board meetings, go to your city council meetings, support the ACLU. One of the things that struck me over the years, of course, when I came out, there was no pride whatsoever, but the Gay Liberation Front started organizing here in 1970. Well, now we have pride, we have big businesses spending big money on floats and stuff, in the Pride Parade. And so we have gone from being invisible and unmentionable to being a commercial target for corporate marketing. And I'm wondering, Reid, you had something to say about that earlier. Can we lean on these guys and see if we can get them to speak on our behalf?
Well, when we're talking about trans kids, it's a little difficult because they're not the ones spending money and buying things from the corporations. So will they get on board around trans youth issues? Trans issues in general, they might, because maybe we are buying things from their company and maybe they have trans employees. So that might make a difference. But I think that's one reason, and Mikki, you can speak to this more than I can. That's one reason they're probably targeting trans youth, is because that's a very vulnerable population that can't speak up for itself. And they're not voting.
Yeah. They seem to have chosen the very most vulnerable target, and the one with no strength and power whatsoever. But I'm recalling some of the big floats in the Pride Parade thing. Thinking, and I believe some corporations have actually spoken out about this. Mikki, do you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see more of that. One organization that took a strong stand on these issues was the NCAA, so the College Athletic Association. They said they aren't going to hold championships in states that discriminate against trans athletes. And a lot of people think that's why these bills weren't moving forward in places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Florida. If you really, if you speak, not just with your words, but with your actions, I think it can make a big difference. I remember several years ago when Indiana was poised to pass a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Salesforce, the big tech company, announced they were going to move their headquarters out of there, and that had a very strong effect on the Indiana legislature. I'd love to see corporations make more moves like that. I think if they did, and it would send these state legislatures a message that you can't just pick on a group like trans kids and expect not to pay a cost for it.
Yeah, that's I am hoping. Well, I'm still not used to the general idea that people on the queer spectrum are even a commercial market yet. I go to Prides and look around and think, what is all this anyway? But they, those people do show up, at least at our celebrations. And yeah, even a letter writing campaign might help. Some of them stand up to legislatures where where these horrible things are happening. We're in Portland, we're of course it's a big enough, I say, and not being trans, I don't know about that, but Portland seems to have a large enough population that there's reasonable amount of safety or a place to hide. Do you know what's going on in smaller towns around the state? Reid, does PFLAG has chapters all over now, don't they? I've lost touch.
Yeah. PFLAG does have chapters in a number of the small towns in the state. And I'd have to reach out and find out more about what they're experiencing right now, especially with this move towards some of the counties wanting to move into Idaho and become part of Idaho. That would certainly affect the PFLAG chapters in those areas. Actually, the organization that I'm more in touch with around that is the Portland Gay Men's Chorus, because we do outreach concerts to these small communities after every concert. And that's something that does change hearts and minds. I've got lots of stories to tell about people that have said that really changed me, changed my life, changed my view, all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, that the Gay Men's Chorus, well, and the other ones too. I'm thinking of Confluence and Senior Moment here. There are several local choirs that are all doing outreach. Can you tell me who they are?
Transpose is a trans and non-binary choir based here in Portland, and Bridging Voices is the local youth chorus, queer youth chorus.
Okay, good.
And the Portland Lesbian Choir. How could I forget that? I'm a founding member.
Yeah, how could you forget that? All of that sort of outreach, support to the smaller towns. And I know that one of our queer heroes this year comes out of Coos County, where there seems to have been positive community organization only in the last 6 or 7 years. So we can figure out how to support those. So there's now 4 things. There is the school boards, there is the city council, town councils, which will be doing at least some either trans positive or trans negative things. Support for the ACLU, probably speaking out locally in the editorial page, badgering businesses to speak out where it's possible, and looking around to support any trans positive things that's going on, in any of our smaller communities.
Can I tack on something? Looking specifically for like local clinics that are supportive of trans people. I specifically, when I first transitioned, went to a trans healthcare clinic, which is not widely available in every city. But if you can find clinics like that in your city or in Portland or further out, or just a clinic that in general is like trying to support trans people, getting behind those clinics is very important, especially because I know a lot of them need to raise funds or need help with staffing. Yeah, and they provide a very important service before this legislation hits and like doesn't let them do that.
Can I speak to a comment we just got from Elliot? That was something I was going to bring up. So
Go ahead.
in Grants Pass, there was a teacher and a middle school principal who started a movement called I Resolve. You can Google it and find their webpage. And it was basically completely designed to take away rights from trans students. It was all about legislating who got to use the bathroom, allowing teachers to not use the name and pronouns that students had chosen to align with their gender identities. Thankfully, the school district suspended both of these employees immediately, and now they're under investigation. One nice thing that came out of it, Basic Rights Oregon, we reached out to the Oregon Department of Education just to make sure that they knew about that and to ensure that they were going to enforce the guidance around trans inclusion for K-12 schools. And they said, yes, we're going to enforce that. And also we need to update it in order to spell out the rights for non-binary students, because when they were created, non-binary students weren't so much on the radar. And so that was the silver lining, but the cloud is definitely that there is this kind of sentiment that these 2 public employees felt somehow empowered to try to start something like this and speak publicly in such a transphobic way. Just shows that we have to be vigilant. We have to keep an eye out for this kind of sentiment.
Okay, thanks.
And we have a few questions on Whova. I know we have to wrap up here in the next about 5-6 minutes. Did we want to do some Q&A next?
Sure.
Okay. One of the questions we have is, do you have any books you might recommend to help raise awareness around these issues?
Reid, Mikki, can you recommend books?
Well, it's kind of hard. I look like a deer in the headlights here because I've written 2 books and I don't really want to use this as self-promotion. And I haven't really kept up, I have to say. I am retired and I know other people have published books in recent months or years. So does anyone else have a thought about that?
Yeah, there's a couple that I recommend. One I thought that was pretty good about trans kids was Becoming Nicole, which was a book about Nicole Maines, who was involved in a state case around bathroom rights for trans students. Her story is really interesting because she's a biological twin, but her brother was not trans. It's sort of a journalistic piece, but it gives a really good overview about trans issues. Another sort of oldie but goodie I thought was The Transgender Child, which was written by two counselors who I think are from Oregon. And it's just kind of a guide for parents who have a trans child in their life.
My recommendation isn't necessarily about trans youth or like the legislation part of it necessarily, but I always like to recommend the book that was published that was Lou Sullivan's Diaries, just because I think he kept his diaries from when he was like 12 until when he died, and he was a trans gay man, and it just is his experience, which I think is very unique, and it's obviously very personal because it's just him writing in his diary in a very, personal, close way, so you just feel very close to him. And I think it's also a very interesting account because of the way that his family reacts to him. I think he was raised in, I can't remember where, I think the Midwest though, but his family's reaction was very much just like, okay, that's who you are. In like, I want to say late 70s, early 80s was when he started figuring his stuff out. So having that narrative of those families existing, I think is very important and very nice to see when looking at a bunch of like historical stuff.
And then I think I'll kind of end on this question. There's a few other I might send out an email so we can try and answer a little bit afterwards. But one of the things we've kind of touched upon some of the ways, like talking about the school boards and things like that. But how do you think, or what is the answer to dealing with the hate and discrimination against trans folks? And that's, we have this backlash with all these. So how do we help? What's the answer to this? How do we solve this issue? How do we fix it? Which is kind of a big question. So I appreciate your thoughts.
I think there's a couple of levels to that. One is the political action. There's a couple of different ways to approach it, but really the most effective approach is to let people get to know someone who's trans. If you put a face to this and actually get to know someone, it's really hard to believe all the rhetoric that's coming your way from the right wing because it's so wrong. It's not accurate. So I think that's a big piece of it, is visibility and being willing to be out. And it's hard to do. Like I said, it's conditional privilege. When I come out to a room full of people, am I still safe? But I'm doing it because I know an awful lot of people who transitioned when I did. I call them my litter mates. And when I think of them, most of them are off living their lives. For every one of me who's still speaking 25 years later, there's 1,000 other people that don't really want to do that. So I do it so they don't have to. But that's a big piece of it, is putting a face to it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the like doing things so other people don't have to is a big part of this. I think challenging people that say fucked up shit is important. There's like a lot of actions that I think people need to take with legislation and like knowing what's going on locally and supporting the trans people organizing around them, I think is very important, but also just kind of like, if your friend is saying something shitty, like call them out. Because that being challenged from someone who like having a cis person challenge another cis person is a very different dynamic than if I say, hey, that's a fucked up thing you said about trans people. People will read me very differently than they'll read another cis person.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in such a bubble. I work at a majority trans organization, which exists to, in part, support trans rights. So I've put myself in a nice protected space. But I think if you're part of an organization, you could try to organize a trans inclusion training. You could try to do something educational around trans stuff. Like Reid said, that's a great way. Introducing people to someone and listening to their story can help humanize something that's just a culture war topic otherwise. And then, yeah, I think what Laura said was great. It does mean more coming from a cis person. You know, if someone who a person sees as their peer is saying that that's not okay, that, you know, that's probably going to cause them to question something.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that coming out across the board. From the time that gay people started organizing, makes a great deal of difference just to see somebody. So if somebody comes out, somebody says, "I really don't think your joke is funny." There are a lot of opportunities to do that, and that has always been a great a great way for gays and lesbians to teach over the years, and I think it's going to be how we grow accustomed to seeing trans people among us and appreciating it as not such a fluke as we think it is right now. This is the time for all of the panelists to ring in and say anything that they wanted to say that hasn't come up yet. Otherwise, we can wind this up.
I do want to say that I want to be really clear in saying I don't think there is going to be an easy answer to the, like, you know, we're not going to solve trans rights issues by challenging our friends and their shitty jokes. And that there's like a much larger structural problem that needs to be taken apart very, very slowly and rebuilt very, very slowly. So this is a much like longer term thing. So I just didn't want to like diminish anything or play down this issue when it's a very big thing that affects a huge portion of people.
Yeah, we're not really going to join hands and walk over the rainbow all together. And I think, from a historical point of view, I think we're witnessing the beginnings of the breakdown of the gender binary in Western civilization, at least. It's interesting that the so-called primitive cultures have it down, have the whole two-spirit business, relatively down, relatively well handled, and the more advanced civilizations have all insisted on male and female and nothing else. That's breaking down. We're seeing it break down. We're seeing it right now. It's going to cause a lot of people a lot of pain, and all of our identities are going to have to shift a little bit to make room for it. So Laura's right. This may go on for another century, and perhaps longer.
Well, I think that's why we're seeing the emergence of identities like pansexual and non-binary. Those are both beyond the binary, one in the realm of sexuality and the other in the realm of gender. And it gives me a lot of hope for the future when I see that among young people, because in a couple of generations, those folks are going to be the elders. And that does give me hope for the future.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess I would say that too. I feel like young people, when I grew up, gender was, we have the phrase assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. And that was kind of like, they give you a birth certificate and you're just supposed to do that. And I think young people, that's not how they see gender. They see gender as something personal to them and something for them to work out about themselves. And that's like a real shift. It's hard for me to imagine politicians getting very far trying to persecute trans people to a generation that's felt that way. And that's, that's like what we hope for the future. And now today we do our work to try to protect the community and promote rights and do what we can to create equality.
Okay, thanks. Well, we've been at this for 55 minutes. We've had some great comments. I'm looking at what's going on in the chat. But I believe it's time to wrap up now. Just let everybody go. So one last round. Any other comments? Otherwise, I'm going to thank everybody for attending. Anything else that my three conspirators here?
Yeah, I'll tap on one more thing and try not to be long-winded. But I do want to point out the dynamics of like how colonialism affected gender. And this is a panel of a bunch of trans people with a pretty specific experience that does not include that. And so I want to put forward that, we haven't spoken to those experiences, and we haven't spoken to the intersection of being brown or Black and being in the Bible Belt, and what that means for people who already have a hard time accessing medical care because of racial bias. But yeah, that is what I want to add.
Good, good point too. Yeah, we get together as a historian. Part of the part of the time I cringe at what our perspective is and how narrow it can be, and on the other hand, we're the ones who are available today, and we have to start somewhere. All right. Well, with that, then I'm going to thank everybody for attending today. Thanks for the great feedback that I'm seeing in the chat panel. Thank our panelists for taking the time to join us. And I'm going to declare this session over now. Thank you, everybody.